Hey, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast about the marketing business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, and I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about why indie games are driving the industry. For years, indie games have been treated as alternatives to mainstream games, such as like AAA stuff and everything. But, more recently, that narrative has started to kind of fall apart. Especially in recent times, because the games shaping player expectations and influencing the industry direction aren't just succeeding, they're forcing the rest of the market to respond. So today we're going to explore why indie games are driving the industry forward. And we're going to reflect on what made this past year a turning point and how player expectations around scope and ambition have shifted a bit too. And also how publishing models are evolving in response. So rather than just chasing hype, we're going to focus on the forces behind this change and where the industry is headed next. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, and how's it going? We're back, and today with us I have Ray Willmott. Ray, how's it going, buddy? It's really amazing to have you here today. You have no idea. I think you do, though.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, it has been like I've seen. We were just chatting before this. Like we met a long time ago,
Long time
and
ago.
it's been a long time since we've chatted. So yeah, it's been really great to catch up.
Yeah, geez. So we never put a number on that long time frame, but I think it's at least been, let's see, we identified at least one project, and I know when that started, and that's been about 15 years ago. And then we somehow recollect that we met sometime before that, and at least we could put maybe a 5-year max. So maybe 20 years ago, 20 to 18 years ago, we met approximately, and here we are again today.
I love how there's that fog in time when as you get older, like you just forget life after about 10, 15 years. Like you get that hard stop of 15 years. Yeah, whatever happened before that didn't happen. Like it's just a blank spot.
Yeah, exactly. Don't worry, folks. We're gonna fill the gaps and stuff offline. But until then, we have really great conversations to have. But first, for those of you who aren't familiar with Ray, he is now he's the founder of Ready Mix Consulting, correct?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I know this is a relatively new thing for you and stuff. But before we get into like what Ready Mix is and everything else, please share a little bit about yourself in terms of maybe your history, what kind of projects you worked on, other companies, studios, whatever. Let's hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was previously, I've been at Raw Fury for a couple of years. So I've worked on some of the recent titles, such as The Seance of Blake Manor, Post Trauma, Monsters Are Coming. Also a little bit of work on Blueprints as well, which you may have heard of. And also been at companies like Thunderful, Code Sync, again, working on games like Jurassic World Aftermath, Islanders, last year in Nostalgia. So, I mean, I've been in independent development now for around about 10 years in kind of a more marketing roles. Started out in SOCOM, led it into brand. And yeah, no, I've actually now spun off and started to do my own thing, which has been quite interesting and exciting challenge.
Yeah, no, and congrats on that. I mean, I know even from experience personally what kind of a jump that can be, but it's but at the same time, there's that readiness too, right? So in light of Ready Mix, what kind of things are you focusing on? Because you have quite a breadth of experience there.
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, I started in SOCOM, so I've been currently actually been doing a lot of TikToks, which has been quite an adjustment for me because it's been a while since I've kind of got into that world. But that's been a nice challenge, and there's been some good results there. But I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, I've been in brand development, so I'm doing a lot of work in the brand and the marketing side, helping out and supporting PR and influencers, but even like just like working on like go-to-market strategies and things like that. So I mean, it's been quite interesting. I think the difference in sometimes when working a publisher, you tend to have your defined role, whereas in this, it's been a lot more kind of like I'm spread across 5 or 6 different roles, which I think is the adjustment, right? But I think it's also a fun challenge because it tests some of the skills that you may haven't have used for a couple of years, and you get to learn new things about the way the market's evolved from that. So I think that's the big challenge, but it's fun too.
Yeah, no, I agree because I can relate to that in a lot of ways too with some projects I'm working on now, working on things that like, oh, I typically don't get to do this stuff. And wow, it's allowing me to expand a little bit more, but also use stuff that I haven't, it's good stuff. So, hey, I know then too with this new venture and everything else, you're probably like super busy. There's never enough time to do everything. But in those moments that you do have some time to unwind or I don't know, give yourself some space from these projects and stuff, what are kind of things you do in your spare time when you do have it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as I feel like anyone in games, most people in games play a lot of games, so I definitely do that, which is great. I do spend a lot of time at the cinema, not as much as I'd like to, but there was a point when I used to go like almost every week to kind of watch almost every film that released. But I'm more sort of going with like the bigger releases these days. But the big thing I tend to do is, and actually is part of what I'm doing at ReadyMix, is narrative design and also writing. So I'm currently working on a couple of fictional drafts. One is like a short story compilation. So that's been actually really nice. And it's kind of something I've disciplined myself into this year because I really wanted to make sure that I get a draft finished and finalized. And I want to get to the stage of pitching. But it's just so therapeutic because I feel like it's allowing the creativity within me to kind of be expressed in a different way. And I think that is actually quite freeing and enjoyable, right? So yeah, so quite varied stuff. But yeah, it's a fun thing to do.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that about yourself. But you know what? I want to take a moment to get to know you a little bit more, as I'm sure our listeners do. And to do that, folks, we have the Q Box round, which is just a few random questions I prepared here for Ray today. So, Ray, the question is, are you ready for the Q Box round?
Let's do it.
All right, excellent. So first is, name one thing that motivates you every day.
So I'm going to say people, and I know that's probably an interesting one, but I find I've worked and I've been blessed to work on some awesome projects over the years, some of that I mentioned at the top there, but I've always worked at and been at my best when I'm around good people and good teams. And I know that sounds a little bit cliche, but it's true. I've genuinely say I've done some of my best work, for instance, at Raw Fury, because that group of people for me is probably the best group of people that I've ever worked with. So I've done a lot of different things in my career. I've worked in social services, I've worked in education, I've worked in, all kinds of different departments. And for me, like that group of people just really stuck and resonate with me for various different reasons. They just come to work inspired, they're full of experience, great ideas and insights, but they're also just incredibly humble people, down to earth, and they care about one another. Coatsink's another good example of that as well. They were a very small team. I think the difference there, Raw Fury is a much bigger unit, whereas Coatsink is more of a small, like 6-person team that we had. But we all just trusted each other and we worked well together. And I think I did my best work because of that. So I think that just really motivates me to be around good people, and I try to match that energy of the people that I work with.
Oh, I absolutely love that. That's such a good one too. And I think that is a little bit unique, but still very good take. All right, next is, what's the most helpful or impactful advice you've ever received?
I mean, as I mentioned, I've done a lot of different things in my career, so I've had lots of different advice. I think the one thing that really stuck, and it's something that I've always come back to, is just being professional, being kind, and just kind of staying true to what matters most to you. So, and it's helpful, impactful to me because there's been several times in my career where I've left a job or maybe a contract ended, but then I've somehow ended up back at that same place again, working with the same people. And, and that often came because we enjoyed working together, or they valued something that I did, or I valued working with them, and they left a good impression on me. And those things happened because they remembered me, they knew what I could do, and they knew what to expect from my work. So I felt safe with them, and I knew their work would be safe with me. So I think that's the advice out there, that there's always advice that you should never take backward steps in a career. So like, don't go to somewhere that you've already previously been. But I've never really felt that to be the case. And I think, if you look at the world today, that this ever crazy market where there's one layoff after another, I think security is one of the most valuable currencies that any of us can have professionally. There's no shame in taking a safe bet, I don't think, because more often than not, now more than ever, it's a smart bet, and quite possibly maybe set to do your best work that you haven't done yet. You just don't know that. So yeah, I feel like that's kind of the advice that has left the biggest impression on me, and I've acted upon, right?
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely love that perspective too, and it goes a long way too, as you said, because of this current climate and everything else. So absolutely love that take. All right, last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
Too many. I think my good example there would be Dark Souls 3, which I know is 10 years too late. Forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm very late to the bandwagon. But I've been gradually working through the original trilogy and Demons. And I actually kicked this off by the Demons Souls remake when that came out on PS5. So I feel like it started there, and I kind of just been working my way through the OGs. I just finished Dark Souls 3, so I'm quite proud of myself. So that tips off the original trilogy. But the reason I did it was kind of to get into Elden Ring, because I jumped off and off on Elden Ring a few times. So my idea was if I finish the OGs, I can then treat myself to going on to the beautiful beast that is Elden Ring. So that's one of my big ones at the minute. But I'm also playing the usual stuff like Expedition 33. You know, I did play that earlier last year, but I didn't finish it. So I'm finishing that up. I spent a lot of time with Pokemon Legends over Christmas. I had to shiny hunt. I just had to shiny hunt. And then obviously like games like Metroid Prime 4 as well, which I'm a massive OG Metroid Prime fan. So that was a big moment for me for that to finally release. So I'm pretty chuffed with that.
Wow. Well, you definitely got your library, like you're plowing right into that thing, man. That's awesome.
I'm a weird one. I play games at different times. So if I'm watching a TV show, like that's my Elden Ring time, which I know to some people sounds weird, but like I do two screen a bit. But then if I need to just focus on a game, like that's my Expedition 33 time because I need to focus on the story. So, or my Pokemon time when I'm watching TV, so I try to like mix it up in a way that when I'm doing something else at the same time, that I can pay attention to both just about.
Wow. That is something I cannot do.
It's hard. I'm not going to lie. I'm not saying I do it well.
Awesome. Really appreciate you sharing all that and jumping right into the Q box round. And now let's get into the conversation because this one it's a big one, but it's important and something I'm really excited that we're exploring further. And as I shared in the intro, folks, we're really getting into and discussing why indie games are driving the industry. I think a lot of us have kind of seen this. There's been reflections by others too, and thought it would be great. And who better to ask than someone who's been around for what we said, like easily like 20 years than Ray today. So,
oh God,
so why don't we kick off this discussion with if kind of where we're at now, right? So if we're looking back. And honestly, we're using the frame of this past year, 2025. But honestly, as we talked earlier, we could start seeing patterns in the future or whatever. But anyways, as we look back this past year, 2025, it kind of feels less like a breakout year and more like a reset for indie games. Now, from your perspective, what made this year a turning point, and what does it reveal about where the market's heading?
Yeah, so I mean, you kind of just touched upon it at the top there, but I think if you've been following or you've been working in indie games for any amount of time, 2025 probably didn't come as much of a surprise to you. I think for years now, we've been really seeing some of the biggest innovative moments in indie games for a long time. So, you look back at games like Return of the Obra Dinn, Disco Elysium, Hades, Among Us, Hollow Knight, Shovel Knight, Undertale. There's just so many huge titles over the last 10, 15 years that have just been hugely influential in their own ways. And I think all these games are very well regarded by history. People love them. They talk about them. They're hits that people just keep coming back to. But I think the big thing that they all have in common is they never really got that big mainstream award or maybe the recognition on the biggest of stages because it was never quite their turn, or maybe there was another bigger game that was more deserving at the time. And so because of that, I think in many people's eyes, they've never really cracked through into that mainstream. So I think, like they've always had this cult, maybe low-key feel to them that, people gradually talking about a thing and like, oh, you should play this. And, that word of mouth just continues to spread. I guess I think of like the Oscars in a way where like you get these great films that have never won the best film award, but they're still considered one of the greatest films of all time, which seems like an oxymoron in the way, but it's happened more often than not. So I think the industry wasn't really maybe ready for these games to be at that forefront because if you looked and played a certain way, they didn't push the full potential of hardware, or maybe they were looked at differently. But I think something strange happened. So I'm rewinding a little bit. I will get to the answer, I promise. But I think something strange happened around the pandemic, around 2020, where I think that's where the shift really started to change because independent titles are often made by remote groups of people. They're working with their own equipment, in their own homes, on their own timetables. And then obviously the world was completely flipped upside down for horrific reasons. But in that ways, work was pretty much the same for them. But for many other people, it changed dramatically. And I think those that were set up and structured in that way were better served to kind of like just keep working on the projects and keep them to the timescales that they already had. Whereas you saw with the AAA studios, millions of dollars were lost, investments crumbled, projects imploded, like people had to almost start from the beginning again. So I think this is the first time a lot of people really getting exposed to maybe some indie games, right? Because obviously they were waiting for years and years for like Spider-Man 2 to release, or I don't know, Hogwarts Legacy, whatever it might be, you know. And so those games were a long time away from coming. So they had to kind of look at the indie games on the market. And so that perspective started to shift. And I think 2025 now is becoming maybe the eventual, I promised I'd get to the point, the eventual result of that hard work of trying to get noticed, right? So, you know, when you got a game like Expedition 33, it was the right place, right time. But in reality, any of those games at the top, like Hades 2, Silksong, Split Fiction, even Blueprints, all of those could have won an award in any other year because they were just all excellent games in their own right. And while there are obviously some other leading titles towards the top there in the AAA space, I don't think, when you looked at it objectively, any other game was going to win Game of the Year other than an independent game in 2025, which is an incredible thing to think about, because that would never, they'd be lucky to get a nomination in some years. And we're still not talking about some of the other great games released like Citizen Sleeper 2 and Deltarune and Absalom, you know, all those amazing games that didn't get that spotlight this year. So I'm delighted for Kepler. It's an amazing thing to see. But I mean, I think, you know, even, and this, by the way, is in a year where we've had a new Silent Hill game. Like, how long have we been waiting for a new Silent Hill game?
Yeah.
What the hell? That's incredible. You know, this was not a fluke. This was not happenstance. You know, the market had been crying and dying out for these things, and yet it still did not manage to achieve that. So I think when you're looking at this moment for indie, it's huge, because like, you've had a massive title, you know, universally appreciated. Yeah. And then when you're looking at what 2026 can do, I mean, I think a lot of people feel like GTA 6 is going to sweep everything and everything by proxy, right? And maybe that's hard to argue with, but you know, I think I don't necessarily feel like 2026 needs to be a year that we get another indie game as Game of the Year. But I think as long as we continue to see that momentum being built, as long as we continue to see, you know, these games releasing at a decent cadence, you know, like you've got 5 amazing games there, any one of those could have won. You keep seeing those high quality releases, and people are just going to keep coming back to that and seeing it. And I think you're going to see that space grow and grow. But yeah, it may be an outlier of a year. Who knows? I guess it remains to be seen. But I think, you know, there's a lot of incredible games being talked about now, and I think there's a lot of incredible games we've just seen.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it?
I honestly, the way you summarized everything and looking back is great, because it started to get me thinking about like, oh yeah, there was COVID, and it is what it was and everything. But as you were saying it, I'm like, you know what? And I know this is like for just about every business. There's a big period of a lot of restriction, and then constricting, and then it would like released, and then we saw that huge like spike in activity and everything else, right? But in essence, what you were calling out that I didn't really think about until just now is really like a very big stress test for the industry, for a lot of industries, but obviously, you know, games. And in that stress test, and it goes back to other conversations we've had here on the podcast too, it's like what gives indie games more of an opportunity than like AAA. There's resilience. There's you can adapt, like stop on a dime and pivot and go in a completely different direction without any or nowhere near as much risk or resources like, you know, bigger projects and stuff. And in time, as time progresses, we're just as an industry and stuff, even on the smaller scale, we're going to learn about those things, you know, more and more, become more adaptable, more understanding of, you know, things like marketing and how to run businesses and things like that. So it's just, and because I think by design, I mean, if we look at the industry as a whole, we're just still pretty young. We are very young. It really started, and I'm sorry if I'm very wrong here, but like I think like just like maybe late 70s, early 80s essentially, where it really started taking off. And then I mean that's small. That is a small tiny little window, even though it seems like it's not. And then when you have this, and then with tech and everything else, as you called out, barriers to entry are opening up and everything else, that's just going to really escalate. And then in a time when that stress test is really difficult for these bigger companies, the AAA, and then by design, by nature, really, look at indies. Well, we can manage these stress tests a little bit better than some of these bigger things and not deal with these like bigger, more dynamic problems. And then it kind of leads us into, you know, what we're seeing now, which is really an exciting time. And it really kind of, in light of that, so that's my thoughts. I thought your summary was great because it really started opening my eyes. So why is this happening too? It's like, what are the reasons? And now because of those reasons and that we broke it down like that, in a way, I want to kind of talk about how indies are now, in a way, I could see it becoming a industry driver. So, what would you say? We have some context here, but what would you say? What is it that indie games are doing differently now than maybe the rest of the industry is responding to rather than leading?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think where I see games development is that they're open to just trying new things. So I think one of the things that I look at for instance, Deltarune is a good example of this, is the game isn't afraid to lean into the creator's personality and the sense of humor. So, I mean, that game has a very specific tone of voice and style to it, same as Undertale. And I think when you look at that game, I don't think that could ever work in a kind of in a AAA environment, because it's a very individual product. And it's maybe not the best comparison, but like it's just an immediate game that came to mind. I love games of all types. For instance, I really enjoyed Assassin's Creed Shadows last year. Indiana Jones was so much fun, and I will play anything and everything. But I think there's so many layers to consider. Like, if you're working on certain brands, I feel like you are constrained on certain ways a character can be used, or certain lines of dialogue they say, you can't use a logo in certain scenarios. So in a game you just made yourself, you can do whatever the heck you like. And some of my favorite indie games are the ones that are just full of that personality dimension, like Neon White and Inscription. Thank goodness you're here. A brilliant example. That's such traditional British humor. I love it. It's great. But these games are the creators, they just wanted to make and play, I think. And I think that's where you see some innovation, because these creators are just designing a game that, for themselves in some respects. And if people like it and they do respond to it, great. But from that, I think people do develop a deeper connection to the studios, because they feel some of that energy in that writing, or the visual side with the voiceovers. For instance, if I look at Supergiant Games, like Logan Cunningham is synonymous with that studio, because from Bastion through to Hades, like I think he's been in every single one of their games, and that voice and that tone of voice. And as soon as you hear that voice, like, you think Supergiant Games, right? So they've built something with that, in addition to all the amazing work that they've done. And I think maybe that's because that you're playing a game from a team of 3 rather than 3,000. So that team of 3 is going to be able to inject much more direct personality, and they'll have more autonomy over that. I think, and these games do get strong cult followings from that because of that. Whereas, if you've got a larger team than they are, it's going to be more spread more thinly, I think. So I think for instance, I'm excited for Wolverine. Like, I have grown up loving the X-Men. I'm very excited to hack and slash my enemies in a couple of months' time. It's one of my favorite all-time characters. And that's a core memory that's deeply rooted in me. So I'm genuinely excited about that. But I do think I have a feeling of how that game will be presented and how it'll come across. Whereas, for instance, a game like Mouthwashing, you're almost told to go in blind to experience the game as it's intended. So I think that's kind of where the magic of indie is that, and you see studio heads trying to recreate that magic, but they can't, because they're constrained to the brand, or they're constrained to a certain time scale, or they're constrained to how the product is made. So I think that there's a place for both, in my opinion. That's kind of what I'm getting to, is that I don't think they can indie is definitely leading the way, and you see some inspired like roguelikes, like Hades. I think has inspired a lot of people to make games like Hades. But I think, you're seeing, I think it can only be influenced to a point. There are certain things that'll never be truly replicated because of the way that these games are made. And also as well, just one other point I was quickly going to make, like, for instance, if I look at Blueprints, like, the developer took 8 years to make that game. So these are not like overnight success stories. These developers are working on these projects, toiling away in their spare time. They're not constrained to, right, you have this milestone to receive by this day, or we have to do this, otherwise the budget will have an impact on the budget, and you have a problem there, so you need to look at hold that impact there. Like, these people are just making these games of their own free time. Sometimes they can take breaks, they can come back to them, they can structure them in the way they can restart them if they want to. And that's why these products do take time, and they're not, as a result, these aren't overnight successes, and they have come from a long place of work and effort.
Yeah. And, so many great points that you called out to there. And if you want to call out which I think I was alluding to in some ways, is, the dynamics, right? When we talk about dynamics, there's the more operational aspect, right? So a AAA team, I mean, we're talking about, hundreds and thousands of people working on these projects, and the dynamics drastically change in terms of, like, what's the bigger picture, why are they doing this, what is their model, all these things, right, from a more business objective based perspective. But then on top of that, we also have like what you called out too, like with brand, right? And from that like corporation, big company, AAA studio type perspective, that voice is very different in a lot of ways. Now it can shift, but I think there's also that element of like history, like, oh, we have always done things this way, we're used to it, we know it works. Changing the machine or changing a part of the machine right now compared to all the other parts could really disrupt things potentially, and we don't want to take that risk. So there's a dynamic side of it. But then as we get into the indie side, I think that's the biggest thing right there. And I think a lot of us listening can identify with that, is just we have that ability to inject that personality, that character about the, like, I've said it so many times. It's like, when you're making a game and when we get into the aspects of passion and stuff, you as a person, you as a team, a small indie team, is putting pieces of you into that experience. That's why we generally lead with stuff that we like when we're creating a project. And then hopefully most of us aren't just solely hoping that other people might like it too. But that's still a big part of it though, right? Is like you're injecting yourself into that. And that comes through, it conveys, whether it's very direct or indeliberate, people pick up on that. And when they see those signals, as you were calling out a moment ago, that's something different, unique, and special. And honestly, in an age when there's so much freaking noise and people keep doing the same thing, regardless of just games, like just think of all the other distractions that are there out online, right? And they all probably follow similar patterns and stuff. And then when you have something that comes forward that seems, wow, this is a little bit more pure, original, unique, I can identify or resonate with this, that's where those things really start to stand out. And again, that's really the power of indies. And I think in a time where we're getting tired of all the same stuff or overhype or overstimulation and everything else, this does feel rather refreshing.
Yeah, and one other thing I was going to mention, I mean, it was interesting when you mentioned about leading and rather than following. Problem we had with one game is that it got, so post-trauma, it got very much likened to Silent Hill or Resident Evil, because when you saw the visual assets that were produced for it, the visual quality was so striking and so strong. People were actually making the direct comparisons, which is incredibly flattering, and it's incredible for the developer. But it also did create its own set of problems because, obviously we don't have the same budgets. We don't have the same access to the same resources as those games. You don't have the community of those games. So when you're looking at a game like that and those comparisons being made, it's almost like we were seen to be following a bigger trend, but in many ways we were trying to carve our own trend. And I think it sometimes comes from when a developer, like the tools that are freely available to developers now. I mean, like developers can create something very easily in Unreal Engine 5 or Unity now. And these games can look so good now. Blueprints, like the quality and the visuals of that are so strong. The visual identity of that game, and it ultimately has an indie game. It's an indie budget, so we're not talking 20 million just for marketing alone. No, we don't have those kind of budgets. So right. It's such an interesting time and space for indie, because on the one hand they are able to look better than ever. Expedition 33 is stunning, but it wouldn't have the budget of Spider-Man 2. So interesting.
We were kind of like it. This really segues nicely into this next one I want to ask you, because we're identifying like, hey, these things that are happening, how we can inject character, how there's like followings based off of this, and because you definitely have this experience from a publisher's lens, like how can you tell when a game is like shaping the market versus riding a trend? And I know this can be a tough one, because it's like these are all things we're talking about, a form of projection here, and these are all things we'd love to be able to do, but how can we at least get that sense, or at least from your perspective get that gut idea of one is following something whereas someone is really carving out maybe something new in the space?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And when I think of an immediate example, when you say there is, again, going back to Blueprints just mentioned there. So I think for me, one of the times I sort of go back to is when we first saw Blueprints at Raw Fury, the team's chat just kind of lit up. in a way that I have never seen before. And it was done in a way that basically the company was just starting to play the game. And, I remember the early buzz. I remember there were certain people saying like, oh, have you reached this stage of the game yet? What? I haven't seen this in my playthrough. What the heck? So that inspired them to play even more. And I think just based on those early conversations and those playthroughs and just the hype, this is before this is like really early days of the game with that relationship with Dojibomb. I think that that's something unique, and I don't think I'd seen that, and that made me feel that probably right there is representative of where you feel like there's something special here, and lo and behold, the game released, it's had incredible success, and and it's been critically regarded, right? So I mean, that feeling was correct. And I think when I almost try to think, obviously not every game is going to elicit those feelings and those reactions and the responses, but I think it gives you a good indicator of where, things are going to be. And like, for instance, I've seen that with other games too, like when we've had a team of people around a game, if all of us have unanimously said, this is fantastic, this is great, really enjoying this, I think, and when one of the key things I always go back to as a marketer, like when I'm really struggling to find competitors or adjacent games to sort of compare it to, or to say, oh, this is a bit like this, or this is reminds me a little bit of this. I think it's both a blessing and a curse, right? Because when it's a blessing in the sense of maybe you are at the start of something, maybe you are at the start of a trend here, maybe you are about to kick off a whole new genre, which is like mind-blowing to think when you think of how many games are out there. Or maybe it is dangerous in the sense of like, maybe this game doesn't have the identity that it needs to stand apart and stand on its own. So you have to weigh those kind of things up, I think, to kind of like see, what the best approach is. But I think those are the sort of things I think about when I'm thinking about how a game follows a trend versus leading it, and how it shapes the market. But even like, I think it's just about understanding what the game is and how it offers and how it will resonate, and then from that, then how best to present it.
And do you think like that kind of shift too that you just called out is being driven more by like player expectations? Is it more like the creative freedom that we talked about earlier, or is it even like structural limitations?
Yeah, I'd say all three, actually. I think player expectations are different for indie than the most AAA. So, I mean, a good example, like, Borderlands 4 on Steam may have had, like, say, for instance, it gets like mixed to negative reviews. It will not impact that game in the same way as an indie game getting mixed to negative reviews. Mixed to negative for an indie is kind of like a death sentence in some ways, because, like, the algorithm will just kind of bury the game and it'll get forgotten about in the annals of time. But for a game like Borderlands 4, it'll hurt, definitely. But I think, it doesn't affect them in quite the same way, because there are other channels and other avenues and ways that they can promote and get themselves out there. So I think that player expectation is different in the sense, because I think players realize, I'm using Steam as an example here again, but for indie games, I see it a lot actually, where players will hold back on leaving a review on Steam because they know the valuable currency that it is for an indie game.
Yeah.
So if they're not entirely sure about a game at release, they'll say, do you know what? I'll wait for a couple of updates and see where it lands, in about 2 months' time. Or even some cases, they'll flip the review, which is incredible. Like someone who's left a negative review at the start, and then they'll actually turn it and flip it and say, do you know what? The developer's reaction to the feedback has been incredible. I'm going to give them a thumbs up for this. And I don't necessarily think you see that in AAA titles. So it's a different relationship. And I think obviously that comes from community building with them. That comes with the close connection that developers, like, I see it all the time. Players love it when a developer of a game will come into a forum and talk to them directly, or go onto a Discord, and they will be there and they'll be present, or a Reddit AMA or whatever it might be. And they just love that ability to interface with that developer, or on a one-to-one level, or a team level, whatever it might be. So I think there's that aspect to it. But I think when you look at, for instance, dev creativity can be on full display for these titles, and they mold them in a specific way. And I think leaner and smaller teams have that flexibility to impart themselves on the games. But resourcing definitely does cause issues, because these teams of 4 or 5, sometimes less, are wearing 15 different hats. And in truth, they really get the luxury of getting a specialist in a field where they can generally benefit from that experience, which I think is quite a tricky one. So a coder is all of a sudden becoming a social media manager, right?
Yeah.
For a day.
Yep. For a day.
Which is tricky, right?
It is.
Because that's not what they're trained in. So I think, that's where you look at like the problem solving there. But, I think that there are the structural limitations of that. Whereas in a larger studio, of course, you have teams of people dedicated to stuff. So I think that's the key thing I look at.
And one thing I wanted to like call out to as you were saying that, like on the flip side, when we're looking at like player expectations and creative freedom, like on the flip side being like AAA, I can't think of what these franchises or IPs are, but I remember comments around some of them where it's like, oh, look, another version of this game. It's basically just a slight different iteration of it, but it's the same game ultimately. Like, and then and you see that loyalty start to drop off because there's nothing necessarily novel about it. Maybe it's a different map, a different environment or landscape, but that's really all that's changing. And when it comes to player expectations in a negative way, like, yeah, it's good to deliver something they can align with, understand, make it very clear this is what I'm getting. But if that signal is consistently through various like sequel, like through an IP, and that experience never being the same, that can also have a negative impact. And I think that's more applicable to the bigger titles because it's like with anything in big industries, especially entertainment. I mean, look how movies are made, like 50% plus. I think it's much higher than that, are based off of existing media that already has a good track record. Why they want to reduce risk. If we've built this IP, why expand something into new? Like it goes into that dynamic scenario we were talking about. But I think that's a key thing. And again, it's like, it's almost like maybe it's a world cultural thing from the gaming perspective, but more and more people are looking for these new and different outlets. And if everybody keeps showing the same thing that they're always going to expect, how is that going to be fun? And it's not like we all necessarily need something new, but at a point it does get pretty tiring.
Yeah, there's definitely fatigue, and I think you see adaptations to these experiences, but there's also a lot of remasters of these games that exist. Like, I mean, I'm seeing the big rumors at the minute about, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which I'm very excited about because I loved it. But I mean, it's essentially, it's recreating a game that we played 10, 15 years ago. And I'm sure there will be some adjustments and tweaks to what it is, but that this is, and even GTA 6, I mean, we don't know what innovations it will offer, but I mean, you have an idea what a GTA game is. So, I mean, hopefully there is enough innovations in there to keep it fresh and different and interesting. There are definitely templates that we are very accustomed to now and we see. And, like, I think to try and do something fresh, different, and innovative is tricky in this day and age.
Yeah, especially for, the big projects. But for us indies, well, we got that covered. We have that advantage. So when we're looking at kind of like publishing models or just even the idea of publishing, especially in this day and age, right? What would you say, what problem would you say, or I should say, rephrase this, what problem are, let's say, successful studios actually solving when, let's say, they choose to self-publish or spin up lean publishing labels? Because we're seeing that more and more happen now. I know there's been some big announcements recently, some games that were doing big and they're doing publishing, and you still see these small publishers popping up left and right almost, it seems. But what would you say are these studios solving if they're either doing self-publish or deciding to act as a publisher?
Yeah, I think for me, this is the trend to watch in 26 and beyond. So, I think what we're talking about here is that, when a game goes on to become a massive commercial success, and this leads to the studio then becoming a publisher in their own right to support the astonishing number of volume of games are made. I mean, last year, I think they said now it's nearly 20,000 games released on Steam. That is an extraordinary amount of games. And, inevitably things are going to get lost and forgotten about or not seen. So I think from that, obviously there's a lot of games, as you say, people are either trying it on their own or they don't, or they want a bit of help with visibility to break through the noise. So for instance, a good few recent examples of this, I think, were Inner Sloth, the developers of Among Us. They went on to make Outer Sloth.
Yep.
And the Phasmophobia developers, Kinetic Games, they just announced Kinetic Publishing. So they're essentially now looking at creating this arm to their business that essentially supports gaming, right? Which is fantastic. And, but I think, this seems like a new trend, but obviously we've seen this before. Like, I think Coffee Stain is a good older example of this. I think they were one of the original ones to do that when Goat Simulator exploded and Gearbox and Borderlands. So, I mean, it's happened before, but I'm noticing there's a frequency to it again, which is interesting. But I think the challenge of this, of course, is that folks need to make sure they're hiring the people who have the experience to do this. So, sort of like I was just saying then, a coder being a social media manager for a day. I mean, like these folks have made a fantastic game and, no one can take that away from them. And it's incredible. And it's a multi-million success. But, I think you also need to make sure you've got the right people in place to support this initiative. And I think Outer Sloth, and Kinetic Publishing seem to be doing the right things there, from what I've seen from an outsider looking in. They've got to make sure you have that expertise in-house. Otherwise, you are probably, setting yourself up for failure because, marketing, as you well know, is like it's a very layered job. It's a very tricky job, and there's a lot of work that goes into it that's probably unseen or unsung. So I think for me, that's a big thing there where I'm looking at looking at those kind of games. But I think it's an interesting one as well because publishers will need to be aware of kind of the marketing conditions. And I think when I look at, for instance, how they've been set up and how they're working, is it so much of a problem solved, or is it adding to the increasing noise that's out there? And I think on the one hand, it's great because we know there are so many layoffs right now, and there are people who are looking for jobs. And I think the more opportunities out there for people, the better right now. Amazing. There is the fear of cannibalization, and there's the fear of like, how are these more leaner businesses going to be better suited for the future, or are they not necessarily helping a larger problem? So it's an interesting topic for sure, and it's one that we probably make a whole podcast on.
Yeah, right. And it's funny because it's like when we think about it more, I'm sure a lot of these, like some of the ones you mentioned that started up this, I'm sure that part of the conversation is something around this idea of what problem are we solving or whatever, right? And that has probably two-faced. The more of the focus is probably going to be your internal focusing, like, hey, what does this mean for us? And then the other side is, well, what does it mean for others, like our prospective partners and other people in these communities and in the industry and stuff, right? So it's always interesting to kind of look at things from those perspectives and see what they're meaningfully doing. Because like you just called out too, it's like, is it something that's actually providing value? And I think that's the biggest thing is like value growth, like growth in the industry as a means to drive the industry for sure. But then the other on the flip side is, or is it just creating more noise? And I think those are important things to consider when we get in, whether we're in that position or approaching someone that is. It's really cool to kind of like, I don't look at things from that perspective, and not that in the moment they really matter, or even in the future moment, because it's like, hey, I got this opportunity, I'm going to run with it. But still, it's like when we're looking at things from the lens, at least how this conversation is framed, how else can we as indies continue to drive these things? And I think if we think about that overarching question, that's probably a big one to at least consider.
And hopefully it means we get better games made, right? I mean, obviously there are games being made all the time, but I mean, maybe some of these great games that are not getting noticed are being attached to a multi-million game like Phasmophobia, like having that connection to some degree. Maybe that's huge. Maybe that's exactly what some of these games need. And it opens up fun potentials for crossovers and things like that. But, I think ultimately what I would hope it would do is just help the industry grow rather than, add to, as you mentioned, the noise.
Yeah. So do you think that, as we're talking about publishers here and stuff, specifically indie publishers, do you think that's whether it's a designated, earned, or just indirect role, you think that's going to be the role of these indie publishers for the future? Or do you think, or is there a need for it to change or whatever? I mean, how do you see that role, I guess? Like, because we were just talking about it really. And I think the more I'm thinking about it, I was like, yeah, regardless if it's assigned or not, it seems like that is going to be a role. At least those who I shouldn't just call out indie publishers, just any publisher that's focusing on indie titles.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is one that's not easy to answer. And I think I've heard a lot of people over the years say that the traditional publisher model is destined to die. Yeah. I feel like there's a lot of doomsayers that like to bring this up from time to time, and I think a lot of people have the belief now that there are sufficient tools, tutorials, and resources freely available to people that the magic tricks and the aces that publishers had are kind of been revealed for all to see. So, sort of what you were mentioning there about how people have chosen to self-publish now. So the trick is up. But I don't necessarily believe that myself. I think there is still very much a place for a publisher, and sort of going back to several points that made there. But I think there's a need to be flexible, to adapt, be agile. And I think like publishers that can do that are going to be the ones that are better placed to serve for the long term. We are in a very unpredictable market right now. So, when I'm looking at, for instance, when you're talking about data, for instance, I think, when people are asking you to provide guesstimations and evaluations and case studies and analysis and facts and figures, ultimately, I don't think you can be 100% sure of anything. I mean, you can provide as much data as you want to, and you can look at what the numbers are telling you, but that's not always necessarily what will happen, because a game, for instance, that you thought was fantastic when you were playing it in-house, and all you've had is positive feedback, and then it releases, and then people hate this one specific thing, and then the review score just tanks. And it just catches you by the, it completely catches you off guard because you're like, that's not what the data told me. So I think there is definitely an issue with that. And I think as a result of that, as publishers, we are the ones that the people who work in publishers generally are the ones who can follow this and adapt to this and be most flexible to it, because we're the ones who are closely monitoring this stuff day to day, week to week, month to month. And I think as a result of that, if you losing that would be a detriment to games in general, because you have to try and find ways to you have to try and help a game set up success, is what I always hear. And I think the way to do that is making sure you've got the right heads behind it, and that's not just the coders, that's not just the programmers, that's not just the audio and the sound teams and the graphic teams, that's also people in the marketing and the production side who are looking and closely monitoring everything and making sure the game has everything it needs to be successful.
Yeah. And as I like to always chime in, especially in these moments, like to kind of summarize or distill what you said, it's really about being empathetic, like of all partners, of all team members, of all audiences, of all, like whatever it may be that has some type of connection that can help make that project be what it's intended to be. It's about being empathetic, and empathy then brings on being on the same page, having things what I call alignment, alignment with your team members, alignment with your audience, those types of things. And that's what you're talking about, sounds like, is having the right head, is putting yourself in a position that, goes way beyond just the code or goes beyond just the design. It's got to be really cohesive and be able to connect with all these different quote unquote players in the industry, whoever's involved.
Yeah. And even when you look at, I think when you're talking about the people who are playing games, I mean, I think we're seeing more and more now, people are going back to old games. So when I was looking at the most played games in Steam last year, I mean, like, you still get games like Counter-Strike is up there, Skyrim was up there,
Yeah.
Stardew Valley was up there. I mean, these games are like over a decade old, right? And I think that's the interesting thing that we find ourselves saying, is that there are not always going to be people who jump on a game day one anymore. So when, say, marketing conditions are saying, a game must do well by day 30, otherwise it's a failure, I don't necessarily see that anymore. Like, games have, I think Among Us has kind of disproved
exactly.
that.
That's what popped in my head too. Yeah, because that game just after, I think it was like a year after it had released, all of a sudden Prima picked it up and boom, it's one of the biggest games ever made now. So and even Skyrim is continuing to just see the steady momentum because the eagerness for that, seeing more, and the mod community behind it. So these games have a larger half-life and shelf life than ever. And because of that, and some of these games are even set up for long-term success, like Fortnite. I mean, there's constantly updates to that. I've got nephews who literally will not buy a new game. Like, if you say to them, for Christmas, have a new money to buy a new game. No, I'm going to spend that on Robux, or I'm going to spend that on Fortnite V-Bucks.
Right. Yeah.
Like, really?
Yeah, I know. Like, for me, I would have dived on a new game, but that's not what today's market are doing. So I think you're dealing with such a small currency of players now who will adopt new titles, and the market has to adapt to that. And again, that's something a publisher can help you with, because they have set up for that long-term success to help you over 12 months, 18 months, whatever.
Because, I mean, let's face it, there's still key motivations and audiences we need to target, but those things are also very strong and consistent in other types of experiences too. So,
yeah.
I know we're on coming to time here and stuff, but as we start to close, I kind of want to end on this one, because I know I've seen this conversation in different spaces, and I figured it was appropriate as we're talking about dynamics of teams and indie and small teams and even like big teams that feel indie. And honestly, it's like I'm working on a project that's a very large team and I'm calling it indie, and most people would probably be like, no, that's definitely not. But I'm just curious. We know this line between indie and even like double A or whatever else labels we want to throw at this is blurring a lot between small teams, big teams, you name it. Do we really need a new way to define like these studios and such in tiers or games for that matter? Or this is like kind of my hot take on it in a question. And does anything happen if we don't?
Yeah. I think definitions are changing all the time, right? So, I mean, I think I've seen quadruple A, super indie, micro indie. It's all over the place, right? What I feel essentially today is, A, double A, triple A maybe aren't fully reflective of where we are now. And that's because some indie game budgets are almost as big as some triple A budgets now, and they're far too large to then be considered indie. Then you've got that conversation, if you're attached to a publisher, can you be really categorized as an indie? How can a game like Expedition 33 be indie when you've got Charlie Cox and Andy Serkis in the voice cast? I think all these questions arise because, frankly, no one really has the answer, or at least one we can all agree on. So I think it's useful to have I do think it's useful to have an alignment that we can agree on, but I don't know when that point will happen or when it will occur, because I think games in general, the templates are changing all the time. And as we mentioned, indie is in this very experimental phase, and very projects almost feel like they're taking on them in individual identity. If I look at film, for instance, we talked a little bit about film. I think those lines are quite heavily blurred too, because there's massive indie passion projects. You like, for instance, you have massive projects that have a major name attached to them, but they have very limited theatrical runs.
Yep.
And they're positioned for small box office returns. You get smaller scale films that boast bigger casts than like some 300 million blockbuster. There's TV shows that cost more than film now, which is like, I'm watching Foundation on Apple TV right now, and like the budget for that must be incredible. It's better than some films I've seen. So I mean, when I'm looking at all of this, and it's just, everything is just in this flux, and I think trying to categorize these things right now just feels like it's doing a disservice to the products potentially. But at the same time, I feel like people need some kind of uniformity to understand what they're looking at, because they don't fully understand what the project is. But ultimately, I think it's all part of a fascinating growth period. I think the entertainment, even looking at the title games and gamer, right, is that fully representative of what we are now? I mean, video games is an outdated trope because, it goes back to video like cassettes in the 80s, but we're still using that, and like,
digital
are we more
games? No.
physical media, all this kind of stuff. Like, are they interactive experiences now? That seems way too broad to me. So, I think art in general feels like it's in this place where putting it into a box is becoming harder and harder to do.
Yeah.
In general.
Yeah, no, it's a good take. It's just always an interesting one. But I like to look at it as like me, and this is just my personal take. Indie or not, it doesn't matter. You're just making something you care about and get it out there, and it's like that should be the first thing. Because regardless if it's good or not, and that's going to be entirely subjective in a lot of ways. Well, what matters is, what was it? I'll create a quick analogy here. There's this mountain biking video stuff I watch, and it's very casual. It's I think the channel's called Burn Peak. And the one thing that person says, the host always says, is like, you know what? I don't care how crappy this bike is or how good it is. As long as it's making people get outside and ride a bike, that's all I care about. Because, you have people on either end that are going to like scrutinize, oh, this is why it's so bad. And this is like, well, this is why it's so good. He's like, if it gets you to ride, that's all that matters. So if you're creating something that gets people to play, let's just do that.
Yeah, precisely. And, ultimately, that's what it's all about, right? We just want people to play the game. And sometimes, like, for instance, there's some games, it's better just get them in people's hands and then they can make their own assessments. I think with Monsters Are Coming, I just released, we ended up affectionately coining a subgenre called Tower Survivor because it was a hybrid of a tower defense and a horde survivor. But that's not necessarily what people are using in the language when they're talking about the game. They're creating their own variations of it. So I think interpretation is definitely becoming a way to express and explain art much more, which is interesting and fascinating, I think.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this was such a good one. Great conversation. Real quick, we had so much that we covered. If there was any like quick takeaways, tips, whatever that you could share with our listeners based off of what we discussed, what would they be?
Try to think about your game as objectively as you can. What would people love about it? What would they hate about it based on the trends you're seeing today? I would say if you're intending to partner with a publisher, be open and honest about what the game is and what you can achieve. Don't be afraid of your ambitions and be realistic about what you can pull off. And trust your gut. If you truly believe in a particular feature, or if you're not certain an offer is right for you, listen closely. You know your game better than anyone else, and ultimately what's best for your game. So sometimes that can lead to hard choices and conversations, but as long as you treat those topics with care, respect of yourself and the people in that room, if you're in the right place, you'll be listened to and the project will be better for it.
Damn, I think that's the first time I might have used that word, but that was good, right? Absolutely love it.
Appreciate
Really,
it, man.
really great points. Yeah, that's all I got to say with that because I'm going to ramble if I don't stop myself. Can't thank you enough for being here. And actually, one last thing I want to call out to in light of you kicking off your business and everything. I understand you have a promotion for any folks listening, interested in at least reaching out to you. And please share what that would be.
Yeah, sure thing. So, I mean, if anyone wants to chat at any point, you can get a free 30-minute introduction call to discuss your needs around projects. You can discuss short or long-term freelance, maybe consultant opportunities if it comes to that. Even if it's just a chat, just to catch up and let me know what you're doing, that'd be awesome. So you can find out more details on readymixconsult.com, or you can email me on raywillmott@readymixedconsult.com.
Okay, cool. So, folks, if you're interested, even a chat, I can definitely say that Ray's an awesome person to talk to. But check out the website, readymixconsult.com. He obviously will provide the email and everything else in the show notes. Any other places worth connecting? I mean, if not, they'll be in the show notes regardless.
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn as well. I'm Ray Willmott on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there these days, as I think a lot of people are, unfortunately and sadly.
Yes.
But I'm there.
Awesome. All right. So check out the website, LinkedIn, if you want to follow and get into that whole thing. Otherwise, Ray, dude, it's been great. Love your take, love your perspective. And I don't know, I'm feeling it, regardless of what state the industry is now, I feel a lot like, I don't know, like motivated, excited to see how things are paving out based off of your perspective. And I feel that I think that sentiment is pretty much the same. Yeah, there's still a lot of things that are going on that we don't like to see and stuff. But I think as indies, regardless of where we are on our journeys now, we're in a good position. So, Ray, can't thank you enough for sharing that awesome positive sentiment.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. Yeah, hopefully things get better for everyone. And yeah, best luck with whatever you're doing.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.